The rain hammered against the wooden walls of the safe house in neutral Sweden as Captain William Ashford stared at the photograph on the table. It showed a man in his mid-30s, unremarkable in every way. The kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after passing on the street. That was exactly why he was perfect. It was March 1943, and the war had reached a critical turning point. The Allied bombing campaign over Germany was intensifying. But there was a problem. Too many bombers were being shot down. Intelligence suggested the Germans had developed a new radar system, far more advanced than anything the Allies possessed. The system was reportedly housed in a facility near Hamburg, and High Command wanted it. Not just information about it. They wanted the actual technology, or at least detailed enough intelligence to replicate it. That's where Ashford came in, and more importantly, where his agent came in. The man in the photograph was James Morrison, though that wasn't his real name. None of the names in this business were real. Morrison had been born in Milwaukee to German immigrant parents. He spoke flawless German with a Hamburg accent, courtesy of his father, who had left Germany in 1923. Morrison had spent 3 years working for a manufacturing company in Chicago before the war, and he understood machinery, electronics, and had a photographic memory that intelligence officers dream about. But none of that mattered if he couldn't survive the next 48 hours. Ashford had recruited Morrison himself, back in early 1942. He found him working as a translator for the War Department, bored out of his mind converting German technical documents into English. Morrison had volunteered for this mission 6 months ago, and since then, he'd been transformed. The OSS, America's newly formed Office of Strategic Services, had put Morrison through an intensive program. He learned how to forge documents, pick locks, memorize complex technical schematics in minutes, use dead drops, shake surveillance, and most importantly, how to lie convincingly under pressure. But all the training in the world couldn't prepare someone for being alone, deep inside enemy territory, where a single wrong word could mean torture and execution. The plan was audacious, even by OSS standards. Morrison would be inserted into Germany posing as an electrical engineer named Klaus Zimmermann, supposedly transferred from a bombed-out factory in Essen to assist with technical work in Hamburg. The OSS had spent months building this legend, creating a paper trail that would survive scrutiny. They'd even arranged for the real Klaus Zimmermann, a Nazi Party member, to die in an Allied bombing raid, his body burned beyond recognition. Morrison would literally be stepping into a dead man's shoes. The target was the Telefunken facility on the outskirts of Hamburg, where German scientists were developing the Würzburg Riese radar system. This massive dish antenna could track Allied bombers with unprecedented accuracy, guiding night fighters and anti-aircraft batteries with deadly precision. The Allies needed to know its frequencies, its range, its limitations. They needed technical drawings. They needed everything. Ashford looked up from a photograph as Lieutenant Sarah Chun entered the room. Chun was the operations coordinator, the woman who made impossible missions merely improbable through meticulous planning. "The submarine departs in 4 hours," she said, setting down a worn leather briefcase. "This contains everything Morrison needs. Identity papers, work orders, ration cards, party membership documentation, and 300 Reichsmarks. Everything has been aged appropriately." Ashford opened the briefcase and examined the contents. The attention to detail was extraordinary. The identity papers had been folded and refolded to create authentic wear patterns. The party membership book had coffee stains and margin notes in German script. The ration card showed a history of purchases that corresponded with Zimmermann's supposed movements over the past year. And the technical backstory? Ashford asked. "We intercepted actual work orders from the Essen factory before it was bombed. Morrison has memorized the names of 12 engineers who worked there, their specialties, their quirks. He knows the layout of the facility, what they were working on, even the name of the foreman's dog." "The contact in Hamburg?" Chen's expression darkened slightly. "That's where it gets complicated. Our primary contact was a dock worker named Friedrich Weber. He was part of the German resistance, feeding us information about ship movements. But we lost contact with him 2 weeks ago. Dead, possibly, or arrested. or compromised and turned. We have a secondary contact, but we've never used her before. She's less reliable." Ashford felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. Every agent he sent into the field carried a piece of his conscience with them. Some came back. Many didn't. "Who's the secondary?" "Anna Hoffman. She's a typist at the Telefunken facility. Our information suggests she's anti-Nazi, but not actively resistance. Her brother was killed on the Eastern Front, and she blames the regime. But she's never done anything like this before. She could panic. She could turn Morrison in." "Does Morrison know the risks?" "He knows. He wants to go anyway." Ashford nodded slowly. Morrison was that kind of man. He'd volunteered knowing he might never come home, knowing that if captured, the OSS would deny his existence, knowing that torture was a real possibility. These were the men who won wars, in the shadows where the public never looked. The submarine journey took 3 days. Morrison spent them in a cramped compartment, reviewing his cover story again and again, memorizing technical specifications of German electrical systems, studying photographs of Hamburg's streets and buildings. The submarine captain, a taciturn Swede who asked no questions and expected none, surfaced 12 miles off the German coast under cover of darkness. Morrison climbed into a small inflatable raft with a sailor who spoke no English. The sailor rowed them toward the coast, navigating by compass and the dim outline of land against the slightly lighter sky. 2 miles from shore, Morrison slipped over the side into the frigid North Sea water. He wore a waterproof suit that kept him alive, but not warm. The sailor handed him a sealed pack containing his documents and clothes, then disappeared back into the darkness, without a word. Morrison swam. His training included 2 weeks in the cold waters off Scotland, but training never fully prepared you for the real thing. The water felt like knives against the skin. His muscles screamed. His lungs burned. But he kept swimming, counting strokes, maintaining his bearing. After 45 minutes that felt like hours, his feet touched sand. He dragged himself onto the beach, gasping, trembling violently from cold and exhaustion. He had maybe 10 minutes before hypothermia became life-threatening. Moving on autopilot, he stripped off the waterproof suit and buried it in the sand. From the sealed pack, he pulled out clothes, dried himself quickly, and dressed in the worn jacket and trousers of Klaus Zimmermann, electrical engineer. The documents went into various pockets, distributed as a real person would carry them. The Reichsmarks went into his wallet along with a photograph of Zimmermann's supposed wife, actually an OSS secretary who'd agreed to pose for the picture. Morrison forced himself to walk slowly away from the beach, fighting the urge to run, fighting the shivering that threatened to overwhelm him. He found a tool shed 2 kilometers inland and broke in. The lock picked easily, just as training promised. Inside, he stripped again and changed into dry clothes from a second bundle he'd carried. The wet clothes went into a corner, where they'd look like workers' garments left to dry. He allowed himself 30 minutes to rest and warm up, then moved on. By dawn, Morrison was on a train heading into Hamburg. The city was a revelation in contrasts. Despite years of Allied bombing, life continued with a stubborn German efficiency. People queued for rationed bread. Trams ran on schedule. And everywhere, the signs of war. Buildings with blown-out windows. Neighborhoods reduced to rubble, children playing in bomb craters, and over it all, the watchful presence of the Gestapo and SS. Morrison presented his papers at the checkpoint near the main station. The guard examined them carefully, comparing Morrison's face to the photograph. Morrison forced himself to appear bored, slightly annoyed at the delay, just as any German worker would be. "Purpose of visit?" the guard asked. "Technical transfer from Essen. I'm assigned to the Telefunken facility." "You were at the Junkers plant?" Morrison nodded. This was the moment. The guard was testing him, seeing if he knew details about his supposed previous assignment. "Junkers?" "No, Krupp Metalworks. We produced electrical components for U-boats until the RAF decided to rearrange the factory for us." The guard grunted, apparently satisfied. "You're lucky to be alive." "Lucky? I'm standing here in Hamburg waiting for the RAF, To rearrange this city too. I don't feel lucky. The guard actually smiled at that. He stamped Morrison's papers and waved him through. Morrison walked into Hamburg as Klaus Zimmermann. The rooming house was exactly where the OSS had said it would be. The landlady, a war widow in her 50s, barely glanced at his papers before showing him to a small room on the 3rd floor. The room contained a narrow bed, a chair, a small table, and a window overlooking an alley. It was perfect. Anonymous. Forgettable. That evening, Morrison walked to a cafe 3 blocks from his rooming house. This was the first test of the secondary contact. If Anna Hoffman was reliable, she would be sitting in the cafe's left corner booth, reading a newspaper. If she wasn't there, Morrison would abort and try to establish contact through other means. She was there. Anna Hoffman was 31, thin in the way that years of rationing made common, with dark hair pulled back severely from her face. She looked up as Morrison approached, and for just an instant, he saw fear flicker in her eyes. "Is this seat taken?" Morrison asked in German, using the code phrase. "Only by ghosts," she replied, completing the recognition signal. Morrison sat down. An old man behind the counter brought weak coffee without being asked. Morrison took a sip, the bitter liquid barely deserving the name coffee, and waited. "Friedrich is dead," Anna said quietly. "The Gestapo took him 3 weeks ago. He lasted 2 days before he broke." Morrison felt ice in his stomach. Did he give them anything about you? "I don't think so. You weren't supposed to arrive until now, and Friedrich didn't know details about specific operations. But the network is compromised. Everyone is being careful. Can you still help me?" Anna stared into her coffee cup. "I'm a typist. I type reports, file documents. I'm nobody important. But you have access to the facility." "Yes. And you can move around inside?" "Within limits. I work in the administrative section. The research laboratories are restricted." Morrison leaned back, thinking fast. This was worse than he'd hoped, but not impossible. Every operation required adaptation. "Can you get me assigned to work detail inside the facility?" "Maybe. They're always short of technical staff. But you'll need to pass a security interview." "I'll pass." Anna studied him for a long moment. "You're American, aren't you? Your German is excellent, but there's something in the way you hold yourself. Americans walk differently." Morrison felt a flash of panic, but kept his face neutral. "I'm from Milwaukee. My father was German. I grew up speaking German at home." "Milwaukee," Anna repeated slowly. "I had a cousin who emigrated there in 1931. She wrote to us about the city. Wide streets, cars everywhere, buildings made of steel and glass." This was another test. Morrison thought quickly. "Depends on the neighborhood. The German parts of the city are older. Buildings from the 1880s mostly. My street had a butcher, a bakery, a church. Not so different from here, actually. Just cleaner. Less rubble." Anna almost smiled at that. "You'll do," she said. "But be careful. The security officer is a man named Hans Dietrich. He's Gestapo, very thorough. He'll ask you about your party membership, your loyalty, your political views. He'll try to trip you up." "I'll be ready. And one more thing." Anna reached into her purse and pulled out a small paper package. "These are real Krupp factory identification documents. I obtained them through connections. Study them. If Dietrich asks for technical details about your previous work, you need to match what these documents say." Morrison took the package carefully. "Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm doing this for my brother. He died at Stalingrad believing Hitler's lies. I want those lies to die too." They left the cafe separately. Morrison walked back to his rooming house, taking an indirect route, checking for surveillance. The OSS had trained him to spot tails, to notice the same face twice, to recognize surveillance patterns. He saw nothing suspicious, but that didn't mean he was clean. Back in his room, Morrison studied the Krupp documents by candlelight. The power was rationed, electricity only available for a few hours each evening. The documents were genuine, and they gave him exactly what he needed: specific project numbers, supervisor names, technical specifications, for electrical components used in submarine systems. For 3 days, Morrison established his routine. He walked around Hamburg, memorizing streets and landmarks. He ate in different cafes, always watching, always listening. He visited the public library and read technical journals. He was Klaus Zimmermann, unremarkable engineer, newly arrived in a city that had too much to worry about to pay attention to one more anonymous face. On the 4th day, Anna met him at a different cafe and told him the appointment was scheduled. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, he would interview with Hans Dietrich. That night, Morrison barely slept. He reviewed his cover story repeatedly, testing himself, looking for holes. By dawn, he was exhausted but ready. The Telefunken facility sprawled across several acres on Hamburg's northern edge. Guard towers, barbed wire fences, checkpoints. This was one of the Reich's most sensitive installations, and security reflected that. Morrison presented his papers at the main gate, and a guard escorted him to the administrative building. Hans Dietrich's office was on the 2nd floor, a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a portrait of Hitler on the wall. Dietrich himself was surprisingly young, maybe 35, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Sit," Dietrich said without preamble. Morrison sat. Klaus Zimmermann, born 1909 in Hamburg. Family moved to Essen in 1915 when your father took work at the Krupp plants. Educated at technical school. Joined the party in 1937. Married in 1939. No children. Worked at Krupp Metalworks until the facility was destroyed 3 months ago. Correct. Correct. Why no children? The question came like a knife, sudden and unexpected. Morrison kept his face neutral. My wife has medical difficulties. We've been trying. The Reich needs children. German women have a duty to produce future soldiers. My wife is aware of her duty, Herr Dietrich. Dietrich made a note on his pad. Tell me about your work at Krupp. Morrison launched into a detailed explanation of electrical systems for submarines, referencing specific project numbers from the documents Anna had provided. He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew his subject, dropping in technical details, minor complaints about material shortages, observations about engineering challenges. Dietrich listened without interruption, then asked, "Who was your supervisor?" "Hauptmann Friedrich Vogel." "Describe him." Morrison had memorized this. 56 years old. Veteran of the Great War. Lost his left eye at Verdun. Wore a monocle over the empty socket to cover it. Had a limp from the same injury. Brilliant engineer, but terrible with paperwork. His desk was always covered in requisition forms he hadn't filed. What was the name of the guard at the main gate? Which one? There were several. Old Heinrich worked mornings. He was maybe 65, white beard, always complained about his knees. The afternoon shift was 2 younger men, Werner and Paul. Werner was party to the core, always had his pin polished. Paul was quieter, kept to himself. Dietrich made more notes. The interview continued for 2 hours. Questions about Morrison's technical knowledge, his political views, his family, his friends, his opinions on the war. Through it all, Morrison maintained his character. He was Klaus Zimmermann, a skilled engineer who joined the party because it was good for his career, who supported the war because he was German, but who wasn't fanatical about anything except doing good work. Finally, Dietrich leaned back in his chair. "You seem competent. We need engineers. You'll start tomorrow in the maintenance section. You'll report to Oberingenieur Schmidt. He'll assign your duties. You'll receive a temporary badge today. After 3 months, if your work is satisfactory, it will become permanent." "Thank you, Herr Dietrich." "One more thing, Zimmermann. This facility is critical to the war effort. We have had incidents of sabotage. If you see anything suspicious, anyone behaving strangely, you will report it immediately. Understand?" "Of course. You may go." Morrison left the office, fighting the urge to run. The hardest part was over. He was inside. The maintenance section occupied a building on the facility's eastern side. Oberingenieur Schmidt was a heavy-set man in his 60s, more interested in keeping equipment running than in politics. He assigned Morrison to a team responsible for maintaining the electrical systems throughout the complex. It was perfect. Over the next 2 weeks, Morrison established himself as a reliable worker. He showed up on time, did his work competently, and kept his mouth shut. He made no friends, but earned no enemies. He was invisible in the way only the truly competent can be in a large organization. And he watched. He learned the facility's layout, its routines, its security procedures. He identified the research building where the radar work was conducted, a 3-story structure surrounded by additional fencing and guards. He noted when shifts changed, when security patrols made their rounds, where cameras were positioned. He also identified his target. Dr. Werner Hartmann was the lead engineer on the Würzburg Riese project. He was in his mid-40s, balding, with thick glasses and the perpetual stoop of someone who spent too much time hunched over technical drawings. Hartmann worked brutal hours, often staying in the research building until late evening. More importantly, Hartmann was a creature of habit. Every day at 3 o'clock, he took a 30-minute break in the facility's small cafeteria. He always sat at the same table, always drank the same weak coffee, and always brought technical journals to read. Morrison began taking his breaks at the same time. It took 3 days before Hartmann noticed him. Morrison was sitting at an adjacent table, reading a technical manual on electrical circuit design. He'd arranged it so Hartmann could see the pages, specifically a section on high-frequency oscillators. "Excuse me," Hartmann said, looking up from his journal. "That manual you're reading, is that the revised edition?" Morrison looked up, feigning mild surprise. "Yes, the one published last year. Are you familiar with it?" "I've been trying to get a copy for months. The library only has the 1940 edition. You're welcome to borrow this when I'm finished." That was the beginning. Over the following week, Morrison and Hartmann developed a cautious friendship built on shared technical interests. They discussed circuit design, debated the merits of different approaches to electrical problems, complained about material shortages and bureaucratic incompetence. Morrison was careful never to ask direct questions about Hartmann's work, never to show too much interest in the research building. Instead, he let Hartmann talk. And Hartmann did talk. Like many scientists, he was proud of his work and frustrated by the secrecy that prevented him from discussing it with peers. Morrison became a safe outlet, someone who understood the technical challenges, who could appreciate the elegance of Hartmann's solutions. 3 weeks after entering the facility, Morrison finally got his chance. Hartmann mentioned casually that one of the oscillator circuits in the radar system was malfunctioning. The research building's electrical team had been unable to diagnose the problem. Production was behind schedule. The military brass were demanding results. "I might be able to help," Morrison said carefully. "I've worked with similar circuits before. High-frequency oscillators are tricky." Hartmann looked at him thoughtfully. "The research building is restricted. I'd need to get authorization to bring you in." "Of course. But if I could save you even a day or two, let me see what I can do." 2 days later, Morrison was escorted into the research building. The security was intense. He passed through 3 checkpoints, his temporary badge examined at each one. A guard accompanied him and Hartmann through the corridors. But once they reached the laboratory where the radar equipment was housed, the guard remained outside. Morrison forced himself not to stare. The Würzburg Riese radar antenna dominated the room, a massive dish antenna nearly 8 meters across, mounted on a precision turntable mechanism. Around it, banks of electronic equipment, oscilloscopes, signal generators, power supplies. Technical drawings covered every wall. The smell of hot electronics filled the air. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Hartmann said with obvious pride. "This system can track a bomber at over 50 kilometers range with an accuracy of 100 meters. Morrison walked slowly around the equipment, his photographic memory recording everything. He noted the frequency markings on the oscillators, the voltage specifications, the layout of the circuit boards. Every detail was precious intelligence. The faulty oscillator circuit was immediately obvious to Morrison, exactly the kind of problem he'd been trained to diagnose. A capacitor was failing, causing frequency drift. He pointed out to Hartmann, who was initially skeptical but then impressed when Morrison's analysis proved correct. "Where did you learn to spot problems like that so quickly?" Hartmann asked. "Experience. At Krupp, we had to keep the equipment running no matter what. You develop an eye for it." Over the next hour, Morrison helped Hartmann replace the faulty component and recalibrate the oscillator. All the while, his eyes cataloged everything: the circuit diagrams on the walls, the technical specifications written on chalkboards, the frequency bands marked on equipment, the antenna's mechanical design, the power requirements, the signal processing methods. His photographic memory absorbed it all. When they finished, Hartmann was effusive in his thanks. "You've saved us days of work. The general staff will be pleased." "Happy to help," Morrison said, meaning it. He just gathered more intelligence in 1 hour than most agents collected in months. That evening, Morrison walked to a different cafe, one on the other side of the city. Anna was waiting in a back booth. "I need to get a message out," Morrison said quietly. "Urgent." Anna nodded. She pulled a small notepad from her purse, the kind office workers used everywhere. Morrison wrote quickly, using a code he'd memorized before the mission. The message contained frequencies, power levels, accuracy specifications, and operational details about the Würzburg Riese system. It would give Allied scientists everything they needed to develop countermeasures. "How will you send it?" Morrison asked. "We have a radio operator. He transmits once a week from different locations. It's risky, but it works." "When?" "Tomorrow night." Morrison felt a wave of relief. The hardest part of the mission was complete. Now he just needed to survive long enough to extract. But survival was about to become much more complicated. The next morning, Morrison arrived at the facility to find unusual activity. Security personnel were everywhere. Guards questioned workers at checkpoints with unusual intensity. In the maintenance building, Schmidt called everyone together. "There's been a security incident," Schmidt announced grimly. "Documents are missing from the research building. Everything is locked down until further notice. Gestapo will be conducting interviews." Morrison kept his face neutral, but inside, his mind raced. He hadn't taken any documents. He'd only looked memorized. But someone had stolen something, and now security would be reviewing everyone who'd accessed the research building, including him. He had maybe 24 hours before they connected him to the timing of the theft. The message was going out tonight, but Morrison needed to be gone before the Gestapo came for him. That evening, he met Anna one last time. "I need to leave." Now, Anna had anticipated this. She handed him a package. Identity papers for a different person. "Heinrich Muller, factory worker from Dresden. There's a travel permit, supposedly transferring you to a plant in Stuttgart. It should get you through checkpoints." "The extraction point?" "The submarine returns in 3 days. Can you make it?" "I'll have to. There's one more thing." Anna's voice was tight. "The radio operator was caught this morning. The Gestapo tracked his transmission. He's dead." Morrison felt the blood drain from his face. "The message. I don't know if it got through. The Gestapo isn't saying." It was the worst possible news. Morrison had risked everything to gather the intelligence, and now he might never know if it reached Allied hands. But there was nothing he could do about it now except survive. "Thank you, Anna, for everything. If you make it back to America, tell them what we're doing here. Tell them not all Germans support this madness." "I will." They parted ways in the darkness, knowing they'd never see each other again. Morrison traveled that night, moving through the city's shadows, avoiding checkpoints where possible, using his new identity where avoidance was impossible. The travel permit was good, though each time a guard examined it, Morrison expected to hear the words that would end everything. But luck held. By dawn, he was on a train heading north toward the coast. The journey took a full day, with multiple stops and security checks. Morrison slept fitfully, always alert, always ready to run. At one checkpoint, a Gestapo officer pulled him aside for additional questioning, but Morrison's cover held. He was Heinrich Muller, weary factory worker, transferring to a new plant because the Reich needed his skills. The officer let him go. Morrison reached the coastal town of Rostock after dark. The extraction point was 15 kilometers north, a remote stretch of beach identified in his original briefing. He had 2 days to reach it before the submarine arrived. He walked at night, sleeping during the day in barns and abandoned buildings. The countryside was eerily beautiful, spring beginning to touch the landscape with green, birds singing at dawn. It was strange to see Germany this way, not as an enemy nation, but as a place where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, caught in the machinery of war, just like everyone else. On the evening of the 3rd day, Morrison reached the beach. The submarine was scheduled to surface at midnight, 2 kilometers offshore. If it came, if the mission wasn't compromised, if Morrison's identity hadn't been uncovered, he waited in the dunes, shivering from cold and nerves, watching the dark sea. Midnight came and went. Nothing. 1 o'clock. Still nothing. At 2 o'clock, Morrison faced the possibility that he'd been abandoned. Either the mission was blown, or the submarine had been delayed, or something had gone wrong in the complex chain of events that had brought him here. Then, at 2:15, he saw it. A dark shape on the water, barely visible against the slightly lighter sky. The submarine. Morrison waded into the frigid water and began swimming. His muscles, exhausted from days of stress and minimal food, screamed in protest. The cold was worse than he remembered. For several terrifying minutes, he thought he wouldn't make it, that he'd come this far only to drown within sight of rescue. But hands grabbed him, pulling him up the submarine's side. Sailors hauled him onto the deck, and seconds later, the submarine was diving, leaving Germany behind. Morrison lay on the deck, gasping, trembling, barely conscious. Someone wrapped him in blankets. Someone else forced hot broth into his mouth. The submarine commander, the same taciturn Swede, looked down at him. "Welcome back," the commander said. It was the most he'd spoken during the entire operation. The journey back to Sweden took 4 days. Morrison spent most of it sleeping, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. When he woke, Captain Ashford was there, along with Lieutenant Chun. "The message," Morrison croaked. "Did it get through?" Ashford smiled. It was the first time Morrison had seen him smile. "It got through. The radio operator transmitted it 30 seconds before the Gestapo broke down his door. He died, but the intelligence made it to London." Morrison closed his eyes, feeling tears leak from the corners. The operator, whose name he'd never known, had given his life to transmit those coded frequencies and specifications. What about Anna? Ashford's smile faded. "We lost contact. She may have been arrested. We don't know." Morrison nodded slowly. That was the reality of this work. You put people at risk, and sometimes they paid the price. Anna had known that when she chose to help. It didn't make it easier. "The intelligence you gathered," Chin said, "has already been analyzed. Our scientists say the countermeasures can be developed within months. You've potentially saved hundreds of bombers and thousands of lives." "What happens now?" Morrison asked. "Now you rest. And when you're ready, we have other missions, other targets. The war isn't over." Morrison thought about Germany, about the facility, about Hartmann working on his radar system, about Anna typing reports in her office, about the radio operator dying to transmit a message. He thought about all the invisible people fighting a shadow war while armies clashed on battlefields and bomber crews flew through flak-filled skies. "How long until I'm ready?" Ashford studied him carefully. 2 months minimum, maybe 3. You've been through hell. 2 months then, Morrison said. "I'll be ready in 2 months." Because the war wasn't over. Because there were more missions, more intelligence to gather, more operations in the shadows. Because somewhere in occupied Europe, people like Anna were still resisting, still fighting in their own ways, still hoping that someone would remember what they'd sacrificed. Morrison closed his eyes and slept, knowing that in 2 months, he'd be back in the shadows where the real war was fought, where ordinary people did extraordinary things, where the victories were counted in stolen documents and transmitted frequencies, and lives saved by intelligence gathered at terrible cost. The rain hammered against the walls of the safe house in Sweden. Outside, the war continued. But in this moment, in this small room, One mission was complete. One agent had come home. Not everyone would be so lucky, but the work would continue. In Hamburg and Berlin and Paris and Rome, in 100 cities across occupied Europe, in the shadow operations that history would barely remember, but that helped turn the tide of the greatest war humanity had ever known. Morrison slept and dreamed of Milwaukee.